an enormous amount of code. You write a book that covers 2.5 million years of human history, and people ask about every section of it, don't they? So I'll try and do justice to all your questions. The first thing I want to say, though, is no one really said it, but we have to make sure that we don't give the impression that capitalism is the only way that has ever caused hunger and starvation. People have always been hungry. I mean, peasants in the 14th century were perennially concerned about whether or not their food... There's a poem, I'll read it to you. The land of Cockagny is marvellous, it rains in these far parts, custard, pancakes, pies and tarts, and look at that river, what have we here? Its currents flow with wine and beer, claret and fine muscatel, sherry one can drink as well, for a pittance all may drink there, new or old wine sure to please. Why write a poem like that unless you were really worried about food all the time? Why write a poem that describes all the things you haven't got? That's really what it's about. What the point that I think people are making quite rightly is what you get with capitalism is the potential to feed people properly, to do it really, really well, to give people the diet they need, not just to live, but actually to be able to live the sort of lives that they need. That's the potential of capitalism. Unfortunately, it falls far from that in reality. It does other things as well. People talked particularly about commodities, and I think that's very important because one of the problems with capitalism is it sees everything in terms of commodities. It turns everything in terms of what can be bought and sold, and this gets really insinuated into every aspect of people's lives. And I really like the person who's described farming as a production of commodities, because that's right. It's about turning commodities into other commodities, not about feeding people. No farmer ever talks about how many people they've fed from their fields that day. They always talk about either how much money they've made or how much volume of grain has been grown. It's never about how many bellies did you feed, because that's not how they're structured to think. It's not their fault. They're not being cruel. They probably do think about producing food for people, but they don't do it. That's not how it's described. And you see it really in terms of, in its extreme form, the solutions that they offer to things like global warming and climate change. Because the politicians and the economists think only in terms of the market, their solutions are all in terms of the market. They're about putting a price on pollution, about buying and selling things. I mean, to the extent that the latest, the newfangled thing is called natural capital, which is the sense of putting a price on everything. Because if something has a price, then it has a value, and surely a society that will take that more seriously. So to the extent that people think about putting values on landscapes, on views, because then it will become protected. The previous Environment Minister to Owen Paterson was a woman who no one here remembers, called Carolyn Spellman. And she did a speech in London just before the Rio conference on thing, and she said, one of the things we have to do is to protect, land and so on. And they put a price on, Tory Liberal coalition put a price on trees in an urban environment of £38,000. That's what a tree in an urban environment is valued to them. And you see the logic of this, because if you say a tree costs £38,000, if you want to build, a factory, and you have to chop down 20 trees, then you can say, as a capitalist, well, we've got rid of 20 trees, which is 20 times 38,000. If we give that money to someone else, maybe they will purchase or plant other trees to make. And of course, it's a completely irrational way of thinking of the environment, but it fits into the logic of it. It goes to really, really extreme lengths. The Irish government, following the lines of this logic, has put a price on the value of the contribution of earthworms to Irish agriculture. 723 million euros. That's the contribution the Irish Department of the Environment has calculated. Imagine having that job. Your job is to work out the value of the contribution of Irish earthworms. I want to know what they did about the earthworms that might go across the border. That's the logic of capitalism, but it's not just about commodities, is it? It's also about how capitalism organises, because part of the problem with capitalism is also that it's competing companies, isn't it? It's people duplicating effort, it's in competition against each other, so there's no logical planning or production to it, it's all in competition, which makes it incredibly wasteful. But also what capitalism does is it makes its money out of people buying goods, so there's a logic to make more things, to sell more things, to make more profits. And you get the absurd, there's a statistic in a really good book by Heather Rogers, who wrote she's an American socialist, wrote a great book on waste under capitalism, Buy It After You've Bought Mine. She calculates that 80% of American goods, 80% of manufactured goods in America are used once and then thrown away. I mean, what a stunning indictment of a political and economic system, that actually most things are produced and then just thrown away or not even used. As someone pointed out, most food, a large section amount of food, isn't waste. And that sense of the system being completely and utterly inefficient, completely and utterly wasteful, at the same time as constantly trying to reach out to find new things. I mean, Mark right at the start mentioned how they the guano, the bird shit. When they couldn't make chemical fertilizers in the early years of capitalism, they hunted around. How can we make fertilizer? Because the soils were becoming degraded, no good for food. There was the yields from British crops dropped dramatically over the years. So they went to the Napoleonic battlefields and they dug up and ground up the bones of the soldiers to spread on the earth. The guano battlefield, and there are islands in the Pacific that are rocks, rock outcrops, that have got an American flag on them. Why? Because one or other country went to there to clear it of bird shit using slave labour, almost always Chinese coolies who died in horrible conditions, cleaned the bird shit off it so that they could use it as an agricultural. So the sense of every bit of it, you'd go to every single part of the world and find something you can make money from or to help your economy. And I think that sense of a system that's completely and utterly out of control and irrational is there. And the Barton Moss is that it's the obvious thing, isn't it? Every scientist who does any of this stuff says don't burn any more fossil fuels, you'll kill us all. Yet the logic of it is the Tory government says we're going to bribe councils to make it more you do this and so on. And everyone should get to the next. I don't quite yet know when the next demonstration is in Barton Moss, but we should. I want to finish though with agriculture, because we talked a lot about food, and at the back someone asked, what will food be like and what production be like in the future? And I think it's a really fascinating question. Firstly, absolutely to agree with everything about people have said about the current agriculture. There's a wonderful phrase an American Marxist called John Bellamy Foster described modern agriculture as the art of turning oil into food, and that's absolutely right. Your pesticides, your petrol fertilizer, and the rest of it. And if you've eaten McDonald's, it certainly feels like that. But what would it be like in the future? And I think this is really fascinating, because I don't think there's an easy answer to this. Because I think, I'm a socialist, and we often have discussions about how would you organise your workplace differently. And it's, in a sense, workers' control of the means of production means something if you work in a factory. You can imagine yourself collectively saying, what are we going to produce today? How are we going to organise the shift structures and the rest of it? I work in local government. You can imagine workers in different workplaces, in the colleges, whatever, saying, how would we organise it? It's much harder to think about how you do that in terms of food production. And interestingly, this has been a debate inside Marxist history for a long time. There's a big question called the persistence of the peasantry. And Marxists have tried to understand why it is that peasants still exist in a small form, because early Marx and Engels actually predicted that the opposite would happen. They imagined that, like capitalism, what you get is larger and larger concentrations of capital, bigger and bigger companies, bigger and bigger multinationals and factories. Actually, they imagined that would happen in agriculture, that as capitalism developed, you get larger and larger farms, much more industrial production. But in reality, in most parts of the world, we don't have that. You do in North America, and you do in bits of Europe and Britain and places like that, but in most parts of the world, small farms are the dominant way of organising it. I've looked the figures up in the book. 80% of production of food in Africa comes from farms that are smaller than 2 hectares in size. That's about the size of just under 2 football pitches. 80% of food of Africa is farm produced. So, and that's 33 million farms. It's not like, that's a lot of people working a lot of land in a large number of places. And they're doing it in small farms. And one of the reasons they do that is, there's 3 main reasons. The first of which is that peasants want their own land. That's the thing you want as a peasant. You want your kids to have their own land, you want you to have a decent farm, and if you have any opportunity to do that with any potential struggle, you take that. The second reason that they do that is the logic of capitalist imperialism is to impose structures on the rest of the world, and actually part of the economic structures of agriculture in the world helps force small farms to continue existing. It's a big debate in the literature, and I summarise it in the book. But the final way of doing it is actually small farms produce more food. Because the big farmer, if you remember that combine harvester picture, enormous fields with one crop, and if you add almost nothing else on that, but no insects, no mice in the fields, it's all pesticide out, just that one crop grows there. Small farms, by and large, are mixed. They have a few animals. They tend to often share space. The classic example of this is apple trees with pigs underneath them, sharing, mutually reinforcing, fertilising and so on. But also, often you get 2 types of crops that mature at different times of the year. But because they're small scale, you can handle that, and the farmers do it. And it produces more food per area than a large monocrop land. It's a better, more efficient, higher yields from doing that. And so there's a lot of people who think the future of farming is small farms. that it's, the idea that, you get more food, it's more efficient, it's better, it's, more organic and the rest of it. And I think that where to imagine a revolution to start, that would probably happen. All the great revolutions, the working class revolutions of history, have often started with people seizing control of the land off the people who've had it and setting up their own farms. So you see a tendency to small farm. But we wouldn't want that to stay like that, because that's backbreaking, drudgery work, that's hard work, that's hard to use tractors on very small fields and the rest of it. And I imagine that what would happen in the future, in a more communal way of organising society, is that you could start to say, well, we want to rationally deploy the technology and the knowledge and share things. You can imagine those small farms becoming part of much wider communal organised farming and agriculture that shares resources, that shares tools and equipment and so on, but does it in a much more democratically planned, rational way of organising things. That's my vision. I mean, I think it's very difficult to imagine what would happen. I think the problem is it's so badly organised now that, anything could happen, that there must be a myriad of different ways to do it. The people I trust to do it, though, are the farmers and the agriculture. I may know a bit about farm, but I've done precious few farming in my life. I suspect most people in this room is. I think the people who do know, just as the people who might run a hospital better, are the nurses and the doctors. I just want to finish with a few other things. The question of can we do it? Can we solve things in time? And can people be brought to awareness? You see, I think there's a real danger, and there's a tendency in this environmental movement, is to say what we need to do is to just campaign over the environment. And I think that can be quite exclusive for people, because actually most people are worried about the bedroom tax, or whether or not they're going to have a job next month. And I think sometimes the environment becomes this extra thing. And I think the job of us is to say, yeah, it's really important, but it's part of all the struggles. Barton Moss is not just about Barton Moss. Barton Moss is about the logic of capitalism and the Tories and the viciousness with which they treat working class communities. If you can turn it on its head as well and say the solutions are collective solutions. If we wanted to reduce emissions in this country, one of the things that you could imagine doing if you were the next Minister of the Environment is to say, I'm going to give millions of pounds to insulate all those old leaky homes that exist in Britain, and we're going to employ 500,000 unemployed, under 25-year-old kids. We're going to train them up in the local colleges, give them jobs, going around, surveying, insulating homes. And that would have benefit. It would create jobs, it would reduce emissions, and it would stop old people dying of hypothermia. What a rational way to think about it. So there's your climate strategies coming together with your social campaigns. The point for us, I think, is to link those arguments in the thing. I do want to finish now, finally, though, with two quotes. Somebody mentioned Frederick Engels, who lived, of course, in Manchester. He talked, obviously, Manchester, about growing city of soot and pollution and dirt and so on that people have described. But he pointed out that there were the people who owned those factories, they didn't have to suffer that. There's a famous book in his little book, Condition of the English Working Class. He describes how the rich built their homes. Funny enough, the names, you'll recognise the names because they're not where the rich live anymore. But Engels describes how the rich built their homes far from the poorest areas, living in remoter villas with gardens in Chorlton and Ardwick, or on the heights of Cheetham Hill, Broughton and Pendleton, in free, wholesome country air, in fine, comfortable houses, passed once every half or quarter of an hour by omnibuses going into the city. And the finest part of this arrangement is that the members of this money aristocracy can take the shortest route through the middle of all the labouring districts to their place of business without ever seeing that they're in the midst of the grimy misery that lurks to the left and to the right. The reality, though, is that capitalists can't do that much anymore, because the environmental crisis we face is not a little localised thing; it's a global thing. They will be as affected by long-term climate change as they can. They will fight like hell to make sure that they benefit, that they have the air conditioning units, that they have the clear water, that they have barriers to stop the refugees coming over the borders. They will fight and organise to do it. Our job, I think, is to start to fight for a system that benefits of ordinary people. And there's a poem from Mark Brecht, the German left playwright, who pointed out that even in the last days of Atlantis, the drowning still bawled for their slaves. You can imagine a world falling apart, and the rich are still trying to make us pay for it and do the work for them. But there is an alternate vision, and I think that alternate vision is very much one of revolution and struggle. Because I think if you start to think about how society could be organised collectively, you can imagine all these things starting to be solved. And at the high points of revolution, we started to organise ourselves in ways that you can imagine then becoming really about us doing society things in a much better way. Here's a socialist journalist writing in the Hungarian Revolution in 1956 about the working class organisations that were set up by workers and the trade unions. He said, in their spontaneous origin and in their composition, in their sense of responsibility, in their efficient organisation of food supplies and civil order, in the restraint that they exercised on the wild elements among the young people, in the wisdom with which they handled the problem of Soviet troops, and in their striking resemblance to the workers', peasants and soldiers' councils which had existed in the Russian revolutions. These committees, a network of which extended over the whole of Hungary, were remarkably uniform. They were organs of insurrection, the coming together of delegates elected by factories and universities, mines and army units, and organs of popular self-government which the armed people trusted. Of course, as in every revolution from below, there was too much talking, arguing, bickering, coming and going, froth, excitement, agitation and ferment. That's one side of the picture. But the other side is the emergence to leading positions of ordinary men and women and young people whom the political police had submerged. The revolution thrust them forward, aroused their civic pride and latent genius for organisation, set them to work to build democracy out of the ruins of bureaucracy. You can take people developing from day to day, I was told, in that sense of ordinary people actually being able to do this stuff, but we're held back by the system. We're restricted and told we're not good enough, we can't do it. But actually, when we have our chance, that's when we can start to take control of it. And you imagine that on a global scale. You imagine those ordinary working people, their latent genius for organisation to start to say, we can do it better than the capitalists have done. That's why I'm a socialist, and that's why I wrote this book. Thank you.